Ranger David Chen heard the crying at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, a sound so faint and distant that at first he thought it was wind moving through the pines. He stopped on the trail, listening, his hand instinctively moving to the radio at his belt. The sound came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human, unmistakably a child, echoing from somewhere deep in the section of Millbrook Forest that hadn't been logged or developed in over 60 years. The crying was coming from the direction of the old Garrison House, a structure that appeared on maps from the 1950s, but that most rangers assumed had collapsed decades ago. David had been patrolling Millbrook's northern sector for 8 years and had never ventured to that particular location, had never had reason to investigate a building that official records listed as demolished in 1987. But the crying was real, was desperate, and was coming from exactly where those old maps indicated the Garrison property should be. David keyed his radio and reported his position and intention to investigate a possible distress call, receiving acknowledgement from dispatch and a reminder to call for backup if he encountered anything dangerous. Then he left the established trail and pushed into the dense forest, moving toward that sound, toward the crying that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that felt wrong somehow, too regular, too mechanical, but still undeniably human in its tone and desperation. The forest here was old growth, trees that had been standing for 2 centuries, their canopy so thick it blocked most sunlight and created a perpetual twilight, even on bright autumn afternoons. The underbrush was sparse in the deep shade, making progress easier than David had expected, though the terrain was rough with exposed roots and hidden sinkholes that required careful navigation. He'd been walking for 20 minutes, following the sound that grew gradually louder as he approached its source when he saw the house through the trees. It was still standing, impossibly still standing, a 2-story Victorian structure that should have collapsed under its own weight after decades of abandonment and weather exposure. The white paint had long since flaked away, leaving bare wood silvered by sun and rain. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle, several posts having rotted through, and most windows were either broken or missing entirely, leaving dark openings that looked like empty eye sockets. But the structure was fundamentally intact, roof still attached, walls still vertical, a monument to construction quality from an era when buildings were made to last. The crying was coming from inside, from an upper window, the sound clearer now, a child's voice calling for help in a pattern that never quite varied. David approached the house slowly, every instinct telling him something was profoundly wrong with this situation, that houses don't survive 70 years of abandonment in this condition, that children don't get lost this deep in the forest, that the crying he was hearing had a quality that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. He reached the porch and tested the first step, finding it surprisingly solid despite its appearance. The front door hung slightly open, revealing darkness beyond, and the crying was louder now, coming from directly above, from what would have been a second-floor bedroom. David pulled his flashlight from his belt and called out, identifying himself as a forest ranger, asking if anyone needed help. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. David waited, listening, hearing nothing except his own breathing and the faint whisper of wind through the pines. Then a voice came from upstairs, a child's voice, but wrong somehow, the pitch too perfect, the words too clear. "Help me. Please help me, I'm scared." It was the voice of a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, speaking with the diction and grammar of someone much older. David felt his skin crawl, every survival instinct screaming at him to turn around and walk away, to radio for backup, to not enter this house alone. But he was a ranger, had been trained to respond to distress calls, and if there was even a small chance a real child was in danger, he had a duty to investigate. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, furniture still arranged as if the occupants had simply walked away one day and never returned. A sofa sat against one wall, its fabric rotted, but structure intact. A dining table held place settings that were thick with dust. Photographs hung on the walls, their subjects faded but still visible, showing a family from the 1970s or early 1980s, a man and woman and a young girl, all smiling at the camera in that stiff-posed way of older photographs. David recognized the location in some of the photos as Millbrook Forest, recognized specific rock formations and trail markers that still existed. This had been a ranger family, he realized, people who'd lived in the forest they helped protect, raising their daughter in this isolated house far from town. He wondered what had happened to them, why they'd left, whether the house's demolition in official records was an error or a deliberate misrepresentation. The crying started again directly overhead, and David moved to the staircase that led to the second floor. The stairs were old but solid, barely creaking under his weight as he climbed, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating walls papered in patterns from decades past. At the top of the stairs was a hallway with 3 doors, 2 closed and 1 partially open at the far end. The crying was coming from behind that open door, and David approached slowly, his free hand on the radio, ready to call for backup if this situation became more threatening than it already felt. He pushed the door fully open and swept the room with his flashlight, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. A small bed with a faded pink comforter, a dresser covered in dust, toys scattered on the floor, dolls and stuffed animals that had been abandoned mid-play. And sitting in the corner facing the wall was a small figure in a white dress, shoulders shaking as if crying, though David heard no sound now that he'd entered the room. "Hello?" David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm Ranger Chen. Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" The figure didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his presence, just continued that silent shaking. David took a step closer, his flashlight beam illuminating the white dress and the dark hair hanging down the figure's back. Something about the hair bothered him, something about its texture or length, or the way it didn't move despite the figure's shaking. He took another step, close enough now to reach out and touch the figure if he chose to. That's when he noticed the smell, faint but unmistakable, the scent of old paper and dried flowers, and something else, something chemical and preservative. David's mind made the connection a second before his eyes confirmed it, and he felt his stomach drop as understanding hit him. This wasn't a child. This was a doll, life-sized, sitting in the corner of this abandoned bedroom, its porcelain face turned to the wall, its Victorian dress perfect despite decades of abandonment. But if this was just a doll, where was the crying coming from? The sound started again right next to his ear, a child's voice whispering, "Help me," so close he felt breath on his neck. David spun around, flashlight sweeping the room, finding nothing except furniture and toys, and that life-sized doll in the corner. His heart was hammering, his breathing rapid, his training completely inadequate for whatever this situation was. He backed toward the door, keeping the room in view, no longer caring about investigating distress calls or following protocol. Whatever was happening here was beyond his jurisdiction, beyond anything he'd been prepared to handle. The doll's head began to turn slowly, mechanically, rotating with the grinding sound of old gears until its porcelain face was looking directly at him. Its painted eyes seemed to focus, to track his movement, and its rosebud mouth curved into a smile that showed too many teeth, sharp and white, and absolutely wrong on a child's face. David ran. He crashed back down the hallway and took the stairs 3 at a time, his flashlight beam jerking wildly, illuminating glimpses of the house that hadn't been visible on his way in. Writing on the walls in what looked like dried blood, scratch marks gouged deep into the wood. More photographs, but these showing the family from earlier looking increasingly wrong, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright, their poses becoming gradually more unnatural until the final photograph showed them standing in this very room, staring at the camera with expressions of absolute terror, while something stood behind them in the shadows. David hit the front door at full speed and burst onto the porch, the afternoon light blinding after the house's darkness. He ran down the porch steps and across the clearing, not looking back, not slowing until he'd put 50 yards between himself and the structure. Only then did he stop, gasping for air, hands on knees, trying to process what he'd just experienced. He looked back at the house and saw it was still standing, still impossible in its preservation, but now he noticed other details. The windows on the second floor were watching him, or something behind the windows was watching, faces pressed against the glass that hadn't been there when he'd approached. The front door was closed now, though he'd left it open when he fled. And he could hear the crying again, multiple voices now, children of different ages all calling for help in perfect synchronization, their voices carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. David grabbed his radio with shaking hands and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Chen. I need immediate backup at the old Garrison House location. I need someone to confirm I'm not losing my mind." There was static on the radio, then dispatch responded with confusion in their voice. "Ranger Chen, the Garrison House was demolished in 1987. There's no structure at that location. Are you feeling all right? Do you need medical assistance?" David stared at the house that was definitely still standing, definitely still watching him, and tried to find words for what he was experiencing. "Dispatch, I am looking directly at a 2-story Victorian house that should not exist according to our records. I entered the structure and I encountered something that I can't explain. I need another ranger to verify what I'm seeing." More static, a longer pause, then a different voice came over the radio. It was his supervisor, Ranger William Marshall, who'd been working Millbrook Forest for 30 years. "David, get away from that location immediately. Do not go back into the house. Do not investigate further. Mark your GPS coordinates and return to the station. We'll discuss this in person." The certainty in Marshall's voice, the lack of any attempt to dismiss David's report or question what he was seeing, somehow made the situation worse. Marshall believed him, which meant Marshall knew something about this house, about what David had encountered, about why a building that officially didn't exist was still standing in the deep forest, surrounded by faces in windows, and impossible crying that came from everywhere and nowhere. David marked his coordinates, took several photographs of the house with his phone to prove it was real, then began the hike back toward the established trail. Behind him, the crying continued, growing louder, now accompanied by other sounds. Footsteps on the porch, the creak of the front door opening, children's laughter mixing with sobs in a way that made his skin crawl. He forced himself not to run, to maintain a steady walking pace, to not look back at whatever might be following him from that impossible house in the deep forest. It took 40 minutes to reach the established trail, 40 minutes of walking through that old-growth forest, while children's voices called after him, begging him to come back, to help them, to not leave them alone in the darkness. When he finally stepped onto the marked trail, the sounds cut off completely, as if they couldn't cross onto maintained park land, as if whatever haunted that house was bound to its location and couldn't follow beyond some invisible boundary. David walked the remaining 3 miles to the ranger station in under an hour, driven by adrenaline and the desperate need to be around other people, to be in artificial light, to be somewhere that impossible things didn't happen. He found Marshall waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for a long time and wasn't looking forward to having it. "You went to the Garrison House," Marshall said, not a question. David nodded, not trusting his voice. Marshall sighed deeply and gestured toward his truck. "Get in. We need to talk somewhere private." They drove to a clearing overlooking the forest, one of the scenic viewpoints that tourists used for photographs, and Marshall killed the engine but didn't speak for several minutes, just staring out at the trees that stretched to the horizon. Finally, he began talking, his voice low and tired, the voice of someone sharing a burden he'd carried too long. The Garrison family lived in that house from 1965 to 1983. Robert Garrison was a ranger, one of the best we ever had. His wife Alice was a teacher. Their daughter Emma was 7 years old when everything went wrong. Robert became obsessed with something he'd found in the deep forest, something he wouldn't describe, but that he claimed was dangerous, was a threat to everyone in the area. He started spending more and more time away from home, patrolling sections of forest that weren't his responsibility, searching for something he wouldn't name. His wife noticed he was changing, becoming paranoid, seeing things that weren't there, or maybe seeing things that were there but that shouldn't be. In the spring of 1983, Robert stopped coming to work. His supervisor went to check on the family and found the house empty, furniture and belongings still in place, but no sign of Robert or Alice or Emma. Search teams combed the area for weeks, found no trace of them, no bodies, no blood, no indication of where they'd gone or what had happened. The official explanation was that Robert had suffered a mental breakdown and taken his family somewhere to start over under new identities. The house was marked for demolition, but when the crew arrived to tear it down, They refused to enter. Said they heard children crying inside, saw faces in the windows, felt like something was watching them. Multiple crews were sent. All refused. Eventually, the Forest Service gave up and just listed the building as demolished in official records, hoping everyone would forget it existed. Marshall turned to look at David, his eyes showing a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. But the house is still there, and every few years some ranger hears the crying and investigates and has an experience like yours. Most of them leave the service afterward, can't handle knowing what they encountered. A few become obsessed like Robert, start spending all their time trying to understand what's happening there. None of them find answers, just more questions and more horror. So now we have an unofficial policy. If you hear crying from that direction, you mark the location, you report it, but you don't investigate, you don't enter that house, you don't try to help whatever is calling for assistance, because it's not children in danger. It's something else, something that uses the appearance of children to draw people in. David found his voice finally, though it came out rough. What is it? What's in that house? Marshall shook his head. I don't know. No one knows. Robert Garrison claimed he'd found evidence of something old in these forests, something that predated human settlement, something that mimicked human behavior to lure in prey. He said it had been here for thousands of years, hidden in the deep forest, occasionally attracting attention when someone ventured too far from established trails. He was trying to find it, to document it, to prove to the Forest Service that there was a real threat beyond normal wildlife. And then he and his family disappeared, and the house became what it is now. A trap, maybe, or a monument, or something we don't have words for. The two rangers sat in silence, watching the forest that suddenly seemed much more menacing than it had that morning. Finally, David spoke again, his voice steadier now. The doll I saw, the life-size doll in Emma's room, it moved. It turned to look at me. Marshall nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. Others have reported the same thing. The house shows you different things depending on who enters, but it always includes the family somehow. Photographs, belongings, sometimes the family themselves, though whether those are ghosts or something else pretending to be ghosts, no one can say. What do we do? David asked. We can't just leave it there. What if hikers find it? What if children wander that direction and hear the crying and investigate? Marshall started the truck, beginning the drive back toward the ranger station. We do what we've been doing for 40 years. We monitor the area. We discourage people from hiking that direction. And when someone reports hearing crying from the deep forest, we investigate just enough to confirm what we already know. Then we back off and hope whatever is in that house stays contained to its location. It's not a good solution, but it's the only solution we have. The alternative is to somehow explain to the public that there's a house in Millbrook Forest that shouldn't exist, that's inhabited by something that uses a dead child's voice to lure people inside, that's been standing in violation of physics and common sense for 40 years. You think anyone would believe that? You think the Forest Service would acknowledge it officially? David understood the impossible situation, understood why the unofficial policy of denial and misdirection had developed. Some problems didn't have solutions that fit into bureaucratic frameworks or official reports. Some problems could only be managed, contained, lived with, rather than solved. What happens now? He asked. Marshall pulled into the ranger station parking lot and killed the engine. Now you write a report stating that you investigated reports of distress calls in the northern sector and found no evidence of anyone in danger, that the sounds were likely created by wind moving through unusual terrain or possibly by wildlife vocalizations. You file that report, you go home, you take tomorrow off to process what you experienced, and then you decide whether you can continue working for a Forest Service that knows about impossible things and chooses to keep them hidden rather than risk public panic or bureaucratic nightmares. Marshall's voice softened slightly. I won't judge you if you resign. Most rangers who've encountered the Garrison House decide they can't continue, can't patrol a forest knowing what's hidden in its depths. But if you stay, if you can accept that some mysteries don't get solved and some horrors have to be tolerated because the alternative is worse, then you become part of a very small group who know the truth and carry the burden of that knowledge. David sat in the truck for several minutes after Marshall left, staring at the ranger station where his shift had started 8 hours ago, back when his biggest concern was checking trail conditions and documenting wildlife sightings. That version of his job, that comfortable certainty about what the forest contained and what dangers rangers might face, was gone forever. He'd heard the crying from the Garrison house. He'd entered that building that shouldn't exist. He'd seen the doll turn to look at him with eyes that tracked movement and a smile that showed too many sharp teeth. He'd heard children's voices begging for help in tones that were almost, but not quite, human. And he'd seen William Marshall's face, had seen the weight of 40 years of knowledge about the impossible, had understood that this burden was being offered to him now, that he could either accept it and continue as a ranger who knew the truth, or he could walk away and try to forget. David went inside and wrote his report, exactly as Marshall had instructed, documenting his investigation of reported distress calls and finding no evidence of anyone in danger. He submitted the report, logged out of his computer, and drove home to his apartment 20 miles from the forest. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, seeing the doll's face turning toward him, hearing the children's crying that came from everywhere and nowhere, remembering the photographs on the walls showing the Garrison family's gradual transformation from normal people into whatever they'd become in those final images. In the morning, he called the ranger station and requested a week of personal leave. Not sure if he'd return after that week ended. Not sure if he could continue patrolling a forest that hid such horrors. Marshall approved the leave without question, probably expecting David to use that time to decide whether to resign or stay. David spent the week researching the Garrison family, finding newspaper articles from 1983 about their disappearance, reading accounts of the failed search efforts, discovering mentions of Robert Garrison's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before the family vanished. He found one article that mentioned Robert's claims about something ancient in the forest, something that predated human settlement, but the article treated these claims as evidence of mental illness rather than legitimate concerns. He found photographs of the family from before the disappearance, saw Emma Garrison smiling at the camera with the innocent joy of a 7-year-old who had no idea what horror awaited her. And he found nothing that explained what had happened, no clues that revealed the truth about the house or what inhabited it, or where the Garrison family had gone when they disappeared. On the 7th day of his leave, David drove back to Millbrook Forest, not to the ranger station, but to the parking area nearest the northern sector trailhead. He sat in his car for an hour, arguing with himself, knowing this was a terrible idea, but unable to let the mystery go. Finally, he grabbed his day pack, checked that his phone was charged and his GPS was working, and started hiking toward the location where he'd found the Garrison house. He told himself he just wanted one more look, wanted to photograph the structure in daylight, wanted evidence beyond his own memory that the impossible building actually existed. But he knew the truth, knew he was being drawn back the way Robert Garrison had been drawn deeper into the forest, knew that some mysteries are traps precisely because they're unsolvable, because the human need to understand is stronger than the survival instinct to flee from things that defy understanding. He reached the location in under an hour, arriving at the clearing where the Victorian house should have been standing. But the clearing was empty. No house, no structure of any kind, just forest floor covered in pine needles and surrounded by old growth trees. David checked his GPS, confirmed he was in the exact location where he'd encountered the house 6 days ago, where he'd taken photographs with his phone. He pulled out his phone and opened the photos, finding the images he'd taken. They showed the house clearly, showed the Victorian structure in all its impossible preservation. But they also showed something else now, something he hadn't noticed when taking the photographs. In every image, in every window, faces were pressed against the glass. Dozens of faces, children and adults, all staring at the camera, all wearing expressions of absolute terror. And in the center of each photograph, barely visible but undeniable once noticed, was text that hadn't been there when he'd taken the pictures. Text that read in a child's handwriting, "Don't come back. Please don't come back. We're trying to keep it contained. Every time someone enters, it gets stronger. Stay away." David stared at the photographs, at the faces in the windows, at the desperate warning that had appeared on images taken 6 days ago. He thought about Robert Garrison, who'd entered that house searching for answers and had never left. He thought about the life-size doll that had turned to look at him, the crying that had drawn him into danger, the impossible persistence of a structure that should have collapsed decades ago. And he thought about Marshall's words, about how some mysteries don't get solved, about how some horrors have to be tolerated because investigating them only makes them worse. He left the clearing and hiked back to his car, leaving the forest behind, carrying knowledge he couldn't share and photographs he couldn't show anyone without seeming insane. The next day he returned to work, told Marshall he was staying, that he could handle the burden of knowing what the forest contained. Marshall nodded with something that might have been approval or might have been sympathy, handed him his patrol assignment, and never mentioned the Garrison house again. David worked for the Millbrook Forest Service for another 22 years, eventually becoming a supervisor himself, eventually being the one who had to explain to new rangers about the crying they might hear from the deep forest, about the house that officially didn't exist, about the unofficial policy of marking locations and retreating rather than investigating. Some rangers believed him. Some thought he was testing their credulity or perpetuating a hazing ritual. But the ones who heard the crying and investigated always came back changed, always understood why the policy existed, always had to make the same choice David had made about whether to stay or resign. The photographs remained on David's phone, a reminder of what he'd encountered and what he'd chosen not to pursue. He never went back to that location, never tried to find the house again. But sometimes on quiet nights when he was alone in the ranger station, he would hear faint crying carried on the wind from the northern sector, and he would think about Emma Garrison and her parents, about whatever they'd become or whatever had taken their place, about the warning written on photographs telling him to stay away. And he would be grateful he'd listened, grateful he'd accepted that some mysteries exist, not to be solved but to be avoided, that some calls for help come from things that don't want to be helped and shouldn't be reached. The Garrison house remains in Millbrook Forest, somewhere in the northern sector, visible to some and invisible to others, calling out with children's voices that sound almost human, but never quite right. Rangers still hear the crying occasionally, still have to make the choice between investigating and retreating. Most choose retreat now, warned by supervisors who know the truth, protected by unofficial policies developed over decades of managing the impossible. But every few years someone ignores the warnings. Someone enters that house that shouldn't exist, and they either flee quickly like David did, or they never come back at all, joining whatever congregation of lost souls inhabits that impossible structure in the deep forest. This is the story the rangers tell each other in quiet moments. The truth that doesn't appear in any official report, the knowledge that gets passed down through generations of Forest Service employees who learn that sometimes protecting the public means protecting them from knowledge as much as from danger. The crying continues, the house persists, and rangers patrol the forest knowing that beyond the established trails, beyond the boundaries of normal wilderness, something ancient and hungry waits in the shape of a Victorian house, using a lost child's voice to draw in the curious and the brave and the foolish who think every call for help deserves investigation. David is retired now, living in a small town 200 miles from Millbrook Forest, but he still dreams about the Garrison house, still hears that crying in quiet moments, still sees the doll's face turning toward him with its too many teeth and its eyes that tracked movement in ways porcelain shouldn't allow. He still has the photographs on his phone, though he's never shown them to anyone, never tried to use them as proof of what he experienced. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, some warnings need to be heeded rather than investigated, and some houses in deep forests are exactly what they appear to be: traps for the unwary, monuments to mysteries that should remain unsolved, and reminders that the world contains impossibilities that bureaucracy and official policy can only manage, never eliminate. The forest remembers. The house remains. And somewhere in the northern sector of Millbrook Forest, if you listen carefully on quiet afternoons, you might hear a child crying for help in a voice that's almost but not quite human, calling from a structure that officially doesn't exist, begging someone to investigate what should be left forever alone.